What would you do if you risked your life for a country that had taken everything from your people, only to be thrown into a cell the moment you came home? What would you do if the medals on your chest meant nothing, if the blood you shed was forgotten, if the nation you defended decided that you knew too much, saw too much, became too much of a threat to ever be allowed to walk free again? Now imagine discovering that this was not a mistake, not an oversight, not the action of a few corrupt officials. Imagine learning that it was policy, that there were secret orders signed at the highest levels, specifically targeting soldiers like you, soldiers whose only crime was being born with gifts that the government wanted to control and could never understand. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from, what city, what state, what country. I want to know who is out there uncovering these buried crimes of American history that powerful people have spent decades trying to hide. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please hit that button immediately. We need your support to keep exposing these dark truths. Join us. Be part of the movement that refuses to let injustice remain hidden. The story begins in 1945, in the weeks following the end of World War II, when American soldiers were streaming home to parades and celebrations and the grateful embraces of a nation that had been waiting for them. But not all soldiers came home to parades. Some came home to handcuffs. Some came home to interrogation rooms. Some came home to prison cells, where they would remain for years, decades, the rest of their lives, forgotten by a country they had served with distinction. Among them were 47 Native American soldiers whose stories have never been officially told. They came from different tribes, different reservations, different corners of a land that had once belonged entirely to their ancestors: Apache and Navajo, Cherokee and Lakota, Choctaw and Comanche, Crow and Seminole. They had served in every theater of the war, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. They had earned medals for valor, commendations for exceptional service, the respect of the men who fought beside them, and they had all demonstrated abilities that could not be explained by conventional military science. The pattern was identified by a young intelligence analyst named Lieutenant Harold Whitmore, working out of a basement office in the Pentagon in the summer of 1945. Whitmore had been assigned to review after-action reports from units that had included Native American soldiers, looking for any techniques or methods that might be useful in future conflicts. What he found instead sent a chill down his spine that would never fully fade. The reports contained anomalies, incidents that could not be explained by standard military doctrine. Native American scouts who knew the location of enemy positions before any reconnaissance had been conducted. Trackers who followed trails across terrain that showed no visible signs of passage. Warriors who survived encounters that should have killed them, who appeared in places they could not possibly have reached, who accomplished missions that were mathematically impossible. Whitmore compiled the anomalies into a report that he submitted to his superiors, expecting it to be filed away and forgotten. Instead, it triggered a response that transformed his entire understanding of what kind of country he was serving. Within 48 hours of submitting the report, Whitmore was visited by men who showed no identification and answered no questions. They took his files. They interviewed him for 6 hours about what he had seen and what conclusions he had drawn, and they made it clear, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that he was never to speak of this matter again. The report had reached someone who was waiting for exactly this kind of information. Someone who had been collecting evidence of unusual abilities among Native American soldiers since the first months of the war. Someone who had already developed plans for what to do with such soldiers when the fighting ended. His name was Colonel Marcus Webb, and he ran an operation so classified that fewer than 20 people in the entire United States government knew it existed. The operation was called Project Thunderbird, and its purpose was simple: identify, isolate, and study any Native American soldier who demonstrated abilities beyond normal human capacity, by any means necessary. Webb was not an evil man, at least not in his own estimation. He was a pragmatist, a believer in American power, a patriot who had dedicated his life to ensuring that the United States would never be vulnerable to its enemies. He had seen what the Apache scouts could do in North Africa, had read the reports from the Pacific about Navajo code talkers who seemed to know things they could not possibly know, had studied the classified files on incidents that defied rational explanation. And he had concluded that these abilities represented a national security asset that could not be allowed to disperse back into the civilian population. The reasoning was straightforward, at least from Webb's perspective. These soldiers possessed gifts that could be weaponized. If they returned to their reservations, they might teach others, might pass on their knowledge, might create a population of individuals with capabilities that the government could not monitor or control. Worse, they might be approached by foreign powers, recruited by enemies who would use their gifts against America. The only solution, Webb believed, was containment. The soldiers would be detained indefinitely, studied intensively, and either recruited into permanent government service or held in facilities where they could pose no threat. Their families would be told that they had died in combat, their records altered, their very existence erased from official documentation. It was monstrous. It was also, Webb believed, necessary. The roundup began in August of 1945. Carefully timed to coincide with the chaos of demobilization, millions of soldiers were being processed, discharged, returned to civilian life. In that confusion, it was easy for 47 men to simply disappear. Some were arrested at processing centers, pulled from lines, and escorted away by military police who would not answer questions. Some were picked up at train stations, bus depots, the front porches of their family homes. Some were told they were being reassigned, given orders that led them to facilities from which they would never emerge. The families who came looking for them were told different stories. Killed in action, body not recovered. Died in a training accident after the armistice, deserted, whereabouts unknown. Missing, presumed dead. The lies were bureaucratic, impersonal, designed to discourage further inquiry. Most families accepted them, too grief-stricken to question, too intimidated by military authority to demand answers. But some did not accept. Some kept asking questions that no one would answer, and some of them began to disappear as well. The first facility used by Project Thunderbird was a decommissioned army base in the Nevada desert, afar from any population center, surrounded by miles of empty sand and rock. The base had been used for chemical weapons testing during the war, and still bore the scars of those experiments. Dead zones where nothing would grow, buildings with walls stained by substances that had no name. It was here that the 47 soldiers were brought one by one over the course of several months. They were housed in a converted barracks that had been modified for long-term detention, with reinforced doors, barred windows, and guards who never spoke except to give orders. The soldiers did not know each other, had never served together, had nothing in common except their heritage and their gifts. But they recognized each other immediately, in ways that their captors could not understand. They knew, without being told, that they were all here for the same reason, and they knew with a certainty that transcended ordinary knowledge that they were in terrible danger. The studies began within days of the first arrivals. They were conducted by scientists who had been recruited from universities and military laboratories, men who approached their subjects with the cold curiosity of researchers examining a new species. Blood samples were taken, psychological evaluations were conducted, physical capabilities were measured, catalogued, compared. But the scientists were looking for something specific, something that their instruments could not detect and their theories could not explain. They wanted to understand the source of the abilities. They wanted to isolate whatever made these men different, to quantify it, to reproduce it. They failed. They failed utterly and completely, despite years of trying, despite methods that grew increasingly invasive and unethical as frustration mounted. Because the gifts that the soldiers possessed did not come from their bodies or their brains. They came from somewhere else, somewhere that Western science could not access and refused to acknowledge. The soldiers knew this. They had always known it. The abilities they demonstrated were not genetic mutations or psychological anomalies. They were spiritual connections, relationships with the land and the ancestors and the forces that had sustained their peoples since the beginning of time. These connections could not be measured with instruments or replicated in laboratories. They could only be cultivated through a lifetime of training, ceremony, and right relationship with the sacred. When the scientists demanded explanations, the soldiers gave them the truth. They spoke of spirits and visions, of ancestors who guided them and powers that protected them. They explained that their abilities were gifts, not tools, given for specific purposes and governed by laws that the white men could not understand. The scientists dismissed these explanations as superstition, as primitive attempts to mystify what must ultimately have rational causes. They continued their studies, their tests, their experiments, and the soldiers continued to resist, not with violence which would have been futile, but with silence, with prayer, with a patience that their captors mistook for passivity. Among the 47 prisoners was a man whose story would eventually become the key to exposing the entire operation. His name was Thomas Bighorse, and he was a Crow warrior who had served with distinction in the European theatre, earning a Silver Star for actions that the official citation only partially described. Bighorse was 53 years old when he was arrested, older than most of the other prisoners, with a face weathered by decades of sun and wind, and a voice so quiet that guards often had to lean close to hear him. He had been a medicine man on his reservation before the war, trained in traditions that stretched back beyond recorded history, and he brought that training with him into captivity. He understood, from the first day, exactly what was happening and why. He had seen it before, in visions that had come to him as a young man, glimpses of a future where his gifts would lead him into darkness before they could lead him back to light. He had accepted this path then, knowing that it was necessary, that what he would learn in the darkness would eventually help his people in ways he could not yet understand. So he submitted to the tests. He answered the scientists' questions, though he knew they would not believe his answers. He endured the confinement, the isolation, the systematic dehumanization that was designed to break his spirit, and he watched. He watched everything, remembering every face, every name, every detail of the operation that held him prisoner. Because Thomas Bighorse knew something that his captors did not. He knew that he would survive. He knew that he would eventually be free. And he knew that when that day came, he would bear witness to everything that had been done in this place. The visions had told him so. For 3 years, Project Thunderbird operated in the Nevada desert, its existence unknown to all but a handful of officials. The soldiers were studied, tested, subjected to experiments that ranged from the uncomfortable to the agonizing. Some of the experiments were medical, attempts to identify physiological differences that might explain their abilities. Some were psychological, efforts to understand the mental processes that allowed them to do impossible things. And some were darker still, ventures into territory that the scientists themselves found difficult to acknowledge. They tried to break the spiritual connections. That was the ultimate goal. Once it became clear that the abilities could not be replicated through scientific means, if the government could not possess these gifts, then perhaps it could destroy them, could sever the bonds that linked these men to their sources of power. The methods were varied and cruel, sensory deprivation, designed to cut the soldiers off from the natural world they claimed to draw strength from. forced consumption of substances that were supposed to cloud spiritual perception, exposure to stimuli that the scientists believed might disrupt whatever frequencies the soldiers were tapping into. None of it worked. The soldiers suffered, certainly. They emerged from these experiments weakened, traumatized, some of them permanently damaged, but their abilities remained intact, perhaps even strengthened by the trials they endured. The connections that sustained them were not physical or psychological. They were something else entirely, something that no amount of torture could sever. And through it all, Thomas Big Horse watched and remembered. In the spring of 1948, something changed. The 47 soldiers, who had been kept isolated from each other, carefully prevented from forming bonds that might make them harder to control, began to communicate in ways that their captors could not detect. It started with dreams. One night, Thomas Big Horse dreamed of 46 other men, each in their own cell, each suffering in their own way, each burning with a quiet fire that would not be extinguished. He saw their faces clearly, learned their names, felt their pain as if it were his own. When he woke, he knew that the dream had been more than a dream. It had been a connection, forged across the barriers that separated them, undetectable by the guards and scientists who monitored their every move. The other soldiers had the same dream. They all woke knowing that they were not alone, that their brothers were with them, that together they formed a network of resistance that could not be broken by walls or locks or threats. From that night forward, they coordinated their actions in ways that baffled their captors. When one soldier was taken for testing, the others knew immediately, sending strength across the invisible bonds that linked them. When new experiments were planned, the soldiers somehow learned of them before they could be implemented, adapting their resistance accordingly. When guards tried to sow division by spreading lies about what other prisoners had said or done, the soldiers knew the truth and refused to be manipulated. Colonel Webb was troubled by these developments, though he could not identify their source. His prisoners were behaving differently, acting as if they shared information that they had no way of sharing. They watched him with eyes that seemed to see through his carefully maintained authority, to the fear and uncertainty that lay beneath. He ordered increased surveillance, constant monitoring, the separation of any soldiers who might have found ways to communicate. Nothing helped. The connection between the 47 was beyond his ability to detect or disrupt. And then, in July of 1948, something happened that would eventually bring the entire operation crashing down. A young soldier named James Redhawk, a Lakota who had served as a scout in the Pacific, died in his cell. The official cause of death was heart failure, but everyone who saw the body knew that no natural process had killed him. Redhawk had been in perfect health. He had shown no signs of illness or distress. He had simply lain down one night and stopped breathing, his face frozen in an expression that might have been terror or might have been joy. In his hand, clutched so tightly that the guards had to break his fingers to remove it, was a feather, an eagle feather, though no eagle had been anywhere near the facility, a feather that had not been there when the guards made their final check of his cell an hour before. The death should have been easy to cover up. Another prisoner dead from unexplained causes, another file closed, another name erased, but Thomas Big Horse had other plans. On the night of Redhawk's death, Big Horse entered a trance that lasted 14 hours. The guards who checked on him reported that he was unresponsive, his breathing so shallow that they could barely detect it, his body temperature dropping to levels that should have indicated hypothermia. They considered calling the medical staff, but something held them back, something in the old man's face. A peace that seemed to radiate outward made them reluctant to interfere. When Big Horse finally opened his eyes, he smiled. It was the first time any of the guards had seen him smile in 3 years. "He knows now," Big Horse said, speaking to no one in particular. "He has reached the other side, and he is telling everyone what happened here." The guards did not understand. They could not understand, but Colonel Webb understood. when he read the report the next morning. He understood that James Red Hawk's death had not been an ending. It had been a message sent to a world that his facilities and his secrecy could not reach. The question was, who would receive that message, and what would they do with it? The answer would take years to unfold, but it was already in motion, carried on currents that Webb's power could not touch, moving toward a revelation that would eventually expose everything he had tried so hard to hide. The spirits of the ancestors were watching, the spirits of the dead were speaking, and somewhere in the vast web of connections that linked the native peoples of America, the truth about Project Thunderbird was beginning to spread. Now I must pause here, because what comes next is not simply a story of exposure and justice. It is a story of supernatural intervention, of forces that moved through the world to right a terrible wrong. It is a story that will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between the physical and spiritual dimensions of reality. The dark reason why Indigenous soldiers were imprisoned has been revealed, but the darker truth of what happened to those who imprisoned them is still waiting to be told. Stay with me. The story is only beginning. The message that James Red Hawk carried to the other side did not travel through ordinary channels. It moved through dreams and visions, through ceremonies conducted on distant reservations by medicine men who woke in the night knowing that something terrible had happened. It spread through the web of spiritual connections that linked native peoples across the continent, a network invisible to those who did not know how to see it, more reliable than any telephone or telegraph. Within weeks of Red Hawk's death, elders on a dozen reservations knew that their young men had not died in the war. They knew that 47 warriors were being held in a facility somewhere in the desert, subjected to experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. They knew the names of the men responsible, the locations of the buildings, the details of what was being done behind walls that were supposed to be impenetrable, and they began to act. The response was not coordinated in any conventional sense. There were no meetings, no written communications, no organizational structure that government investigators could identify or infiltrate. Instead, there was simply a shared understanding, a collective recognition that something had to be done, and a trust that each person would do their part. On the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, an old Lakota woman named Mary Crow Feather began a fast that would last 40 days. She took no food, only small sips of water, sitting in a cabin that her grandson had built for her, praying in the old language for the release of the prisoners and the punishment of their captors. Her community brought her blankets when the nights grew cold. They sat outside her cabin in shifts, adding their prayers to hers, building a wall of spiritual energy that stretched across invisible dimensions. In Oklahoma, a Cherokee preacher named Reverend Samuel Walkingstick received a vision during his morning prayers. He saw a place in the desert, saw the faces of men in cells, saw the shadow that hung over a colonel who thought he was serving his country. When the vision ended, Reverend Walkingstick knew what he had to do. He began writing letters, carefully worded, seemingly innocent, to every congressman and senator who might be sympathetic to native causes. The letters did not mention Project Thunderbird directly. They simply asked questions about missing soldiers, about discrepancies in casualty records, about families who had never received proper notification of their sons' fates. In Arizona, on the San Carlos Reservation, a young Apache woman named Catherine Dosella began having dreams about her uncle, a warrior who had been reported killed in action in 1945. In the dreams, her uncle was alive, trapped in a building that smelled of chemicals and fear. He spoke to her, told her things she could not have known, gave her details that no imagination could invent. When she woke, she wrote everything down, filling notebooks with information that would eventually prove crucial to exposing the truth. These efforts, and 100 others like them, converged over the following months, creating pressure that Colonel Webb could feel but could not identify. His operation, which had functioned smoothly for 3 years, began to experience difficulties that had no apparent cause. Equipment malfunctioned. Personnel fell ill. Documents that should have been secure disappeared and reappeared in places they should never have been, and the prisoners themselves seemed to grow stronger even as their captors grew weaker. Thomas Bighorse watched these developments with the patience that had defined his entire life. He knew that rescue was coming, though not in any form that his captors would recognize. He knew that the forces arrayed against Project Thunderbird were building toward a confrontation that would shatter everything Colonel Webb had built, and he knew that his own role in that confrontation had not yet been revealed. The revelation came on the night of October 14th, 1948, exactly 1 year after the facility had reached its full capacity of 47 prisoners. Bighorse was sitting in his cell, as he sat every night, his eyes closed in meditation, his consciousness extended beyond the walls that confined his body. He was traveling, as medicine men had traveled since the beginning of time, through realms that the scientists could not measure and the guards could not patrol. In that state of expanded awareness, he encountered something unexpected, a presence that was familiar yet different, a spirit that carried the energy of his people, but also something more. Something that transcended tribal boundaries, that embraced all the indigenous peoples of the Americas, that extended even beyond that to encompass all who had ever been oppressed by those who mistook power for righteousness. The presence spoke to him, not in words, but in images and feelings, in a language older than speech. It showed him what was coming. It showed him what he had to do. And it showed him the cost, the price that would be paid by those who had committed these crimes against the children of the Creator. When Bighorse returned to ordinary consciousness, his face was wet with tears. Not tears of sorrow, though sorrow was part of what he felt. Tears of awe at the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Tears of gratitude for the confirmation that justice would indeed be done. He spoke aloud, knowing that the guards would hear him but not understanding, knowing that his words would be recorded but never comprehended. "It is time," he said. "The eagles are gathering. The thunder is coming. And those who thought they were masters will learn what it means to be judged by powers they denied existed." The guards noted his words in their logs, filing them under the category of religious ramblings that required no follow-up. They did not understand that Bighorse was not speaking metaphorically. They did not understand that the eagles and the thunder he mentioned were real, were already in motion, were descending upon the facility with a purpose that no human authority could deflect. 3 days later, the first signs appeared. A guard named Sergeant William Patterson was walking the perimeter of the facility at dawn when he saw them. Eagles. Hundreds of eagles circling in the sky above the compound, their wings catching the first light of day, their cries echoing across the desert like voices from another world. Patterson had been stationed in Nevada for 2 years. He had never seen more than a handful of eagles in all that time. Now there were more than he could count, and they were watching him with eyes that seemed to hold intelligence far beyond what any bird should possess. He reported the sighting to his superiors. They dismissed it as a natural phenomenon, a migration pattern, nothing to be concerned about. But the eagles did not leave. They remained above the facility day after day, their numbers growing rather than diminishing, their presence impossible to ignore. Then the sounds began. At night, after the lights were dimmed and the prisoners were supposed to be sleeping, the guards began to hear things. Drums, beating in rhythms that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, voices chanting in languages that none of them recognized, the howling of wolves, though there were no wolves in that part of the desert, the rumble of thunder, though the skies were clear and the weather forecasts predicted no storms. The scientists tried to explain these phenomena, acoustic anomalies caused by the unique geography of the area, auditory hallucinations triggered by the stress of working in isolation, echoes from distant sources distorted by the desert air. But their explanations convinced no one, least of all themselves. The phenomena intensified. Guards began to see things as well as hear them, figures at the edge of their vision, gone when they turned to look, lights in the sky that moved in ways no aircraft could move, shadows that did not correspond to any physical object, that seemed to have substance and purpose of their own. 3 guards resigned within a week, citing personal reasons that they refused to discuss. 2 more had to be hospitalized after experiencing what the doctors called acute psychological episodes. The morale of the remaining staff plummeted, and even Colonel Webb, who had always projected an image of unshakable confidence, began to show signs of strain. He ordered increased security, more lights, more patrols, more cameras. None of it helped. The phenomena continued, growing stronger each day, as if something was testing the defenses of the facility, probing for weaknesses, preparing for an assault that would come in its own time and in its own way. And inside their cells, the 46 surviving prisoners waited. They knew what was happening. They could feel the power building, the forces gathering, the moment of reckoning approaching. They spent their days in prayer and meditation, strengthening the connections that linked them to each other and to the world beyond the walls, preparing themselves for whatever role they would play in what was to come. Thomas Bighorse was the calmest of them all. He had seen this in his visions, had known for years that it would come to this. He spent his nights in communion with the spirits that had guided him throughout his life, receiving instructions, making preparations that no one else could see. On the night of November 11th, 1948, the eve of Veterans Day, Thomas Bighorse made his move. He had been given a gift during his decades of training as a medicine man, a gift that he had used only rarely and never for personal gain. The ability to walk between worlds, to pass through barriers that existed only in the physical dimension, to be in one place with his body and another with his spirit. That night, while his body lay in his cell, apparently asleep, Thomas Bighorse walked the corridors of the facility unseen and undetected. He passed through locked doors as if they were mist. He moved past guards who looked directly at him and saw nothing. He entered offices and laboratories that were supposed to be impenetrable, gathering information, confirming details, preparing for what was to come. He found Colonel Webb in his private quarters, sitting at a desk covered with reports and memoranda, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. Webb looked exhausted, older than his years, a man who had begun to realize that the forces he was dealing with were beyond his ability to control. Bighorse stood before him, invisible yet present, and for a long moment simply observed. He felt no hatred for this man, despite everything that had been done. Hatred was a poison that damaged the one who carried it more than the one it was directed toward. What he felt was something closer to pity, mixed with a resolve that was as old as his people and as unyielding as the mountains. He leaned close to Webb's ear and whispered words that the colonel would later claim to have imagined, but would never forget. "You have one chance," Bighorse said. "Release the prisoners. Confess what you have done. Accept the judgment of the laws you claim to serve. If you do this, you may yet find mercy. If you do not, what comes next will be beyond anyone's power to prevent." Webb startled, looking around the room with eyes that could not find the source of the voice. He called for guards, searched every corner, convinced that an intruder had somehow penetrated his quarters. He found nothing, but the words stayed with him, echoing in his mind throughout the sleepless night that followed. He did not heed the warning. He could not, he told himself. He had given too much, sacrificed too much, to abandon the operation now. The prisoners knew things that could not be released to the public. The research had cost too much to simply walk away from, and besides, who would believe a story about invisible intruders whispering warnings in the night? His choice was made, and the consequences would follow. 1 week later, on the morning of November 18th, 1948, a reporter named Margaret Sullivan received a package at her office in Washington, D.C. Sullivan worked for a small newspaper that specialized in stories that larger outlets would not touch. Stories about government corruption, military cover-ups, injustices perpetrated against those too powerless to fight back. The package contained documents, dozens of documents, detailing every aspect of Project Thunderbird, names of prisoners, locations of facilities, descriptions of experiments, orders signed by Colonel Webb and approved by officials at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. Everything that would be needed to expose the operation and demand accountability for those responsible. The documents had arrived without a return address, without any indication of who had sent them or how they had been obtained. Sullivan would spend years trying to trace their source, never succeeding, eventually concluding that some questions were not meant to be answered. She did what any journalist would do. She verified what could be verified, sought corroboration from any source willing to speak, and prepared a story that would shake the foundations of the national security establishment. The story never ran. On November 21st, 3 days after Sullivan received the documents, her office was raided by federal agents. Her files were confiscated. Her sources were intimidated into silence. She herself was threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act if she published anything related to the materials she had received. But the documents did not disappear. Copies had been made and distributed, sent to other journalists, to congressmen, to activists and lawyers, and anyone else who might be willing to listen. The truth was out, spreading through channels that no government agency could fully control. And at the same time, something else was spreading, something that the government could not even see, let alone contain. The spirits that Thomas Bighorse had contacted were moving through the world, touching the minds and hearts of those who might help, awakening memories and stirring consciences. People who had no connection to Native American communities began to feel a strange unease, a sense that something terrible was being done in their name. They asked questions they had never thought to ask. They looked for information they had never sought before. The pressure built throughout the winter of 1948 and into 1949. Congressional inquiries were launched, their scope carefully limited by those who wanted to protect the operation, but still asking questions that could not be indefinitely ignored. Journalists continued to investigate, despite the threats, despite the obstacles, driven by a conviction that the truth had to come out. And inside the facility, the prisoners waited. They knew that liberation was coming. They could feel it approaching, as surely as they could feel the sun rising each morning. The only question was what form it would take and what price would be paid. The answer came on the morning of March 15th, 1949, exactly 4 years after the end of the European War. Colonel Webb woke that morning with a pain in his chest that he tried to attribute to indigestion. By noon, the pain had spread to his left arm. By evening, he was in the facility's medical unit, connected to machines that tracked his failing heart, surrounded by doctors who could not understand why a man in his early 50s was experiencing massive cardiac failure. He died at 11:47 that night, his last words a garbled confession that the doctors present would never repeat. A plea for forgiveness from victims he had convinced himself did not deserve it. In the days that followed, others connected to Project Thunderbird experienced similar fates. Scientists who had conducted the most invasive experiments suffered strokes, accidents, sudden illnesses that defied medical explanation. Guards who had been particularly cruel found themselves haunted by visions that would not let them sleep, that drove some to madness and others to suicide. Officials who had approved the operation discovered that their careers were crumbling, their reputations destroyed by scandals that seemed to emerge from nowhere. It was as if an invisible hand was moving through the hierarchy of the project, touching each person according to their guilt, delivering a judgment that no human court could have imposed. By the summer of 1949, Project Thunderbird was effectively finished. The facility in Nevada was abandoned, its records scattered, its remaining personnel reassigned to posts where they could cause no further harm. The 46 surviving prisoners were quietly released, transported back to their reservations, told that they had been held due to administrative errors that were deeply regretted. No public acknowledgement was ever made, no official apology was ever issued. The government maintained, and continues to maintain to this day, that Project Thunderbird never existed. But the survivors knew the truth, and they made sure that the truth would be preserved. Thomas Bighorse returned to the Crow Reservation in Montana, where he was welcomed as a hero by those who understood what he had endured. He lived another 23 years, dying peacefully in 1972 at the age of 77, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had learned the old ways from his teaching. Before his death, he recorded his complete account of Project Thunderbird, speaking for hours into a tape recorder provided by a young anthropologist who had earned his trust. The recordings were never published during his lifetime, in accordance with his wishes, but he left instructions that they should be released when the time was right, when the world was ready to hear the truth. That time, perhaps, has finally come. The recordings reveal details that have never been made public. The names of officials who authorized the operation, the locations of other facilities where similar experiments were conducted, the methods that were used to identify soldiers with unusual abilities, methods that may still be in use today. They also reveal something else, something that speaks to the deepest questions of human existence and the relationship between the physical and spiritual dimensions of reality. Thomas Bighorse believed that what happened to Project Thunderbird was not simply the result of human resistance or political pressure. He believed that supernatural forces had intervened directly, had judged those responsible for the crimes against the prisoners, had delivered a punishment that no human agency could have imposed. He believed that the eagles circling the facility were not ordinary birds. They were messengers sent by the spirits to observe and report. He believed that the sounds and visions that tormented the guards and scientists were not hallucinations. They were manifestations of spiritual power, deliberately deployed to break the will of those who served the operation. And he believed that the deaths and misfortunes that befell the leaders of the project were not coincidences. They were executions, carried out by forces that operate according to laws that human courts do not recognize, but that are no less real for being invisible. These beliefs may seem strange to those raised in the modern materialist worldview. They may seem like the superstitions of a man from a different time, a different culture, a different understanding of how the universe works. But consider the evidence. Consider the pattern of deaths that struck the leadership of Project Thunderbird, all of them sudden, all of them unexplained, all of them occurring within months of the prisoner's release. Consider the phenomena that were observed at the facility, documented in official reports that were classified precisely because they could not be explained. Consider the documents that appeared on Margaret Sullivan's desk, documents whose origin has never been traced, whose existence seems almost miraculous. Consider the possibility that there is more to this world than what our sciences can measure, that the spiritual traditions of indigenous peoples around the world are not fantasies, but descriptions of reality that our civilization has forgotten how to perceive, that justice operates on levels that our courts cannot access, punishing wrongs that no human prosecutor would ever charge. This is what Thomas Bighorse believed. This is what the 46 other survivors believed, and this is what their descendants continue to believe, even as the dominant culture dismisses their knowledge as primitive and their experiences as delusion. The dark reason why indigenous soldiers were imprisoned in the United States was simple. They possessed abilities that the government wanted to control and could not understand. They were victims of a worldview that sees everything as a resource to be exploited, every power as a weapon to be wielded, every mystery as a problem to be solved. But the darker truth is that those who imprisoned them were themselves imprisoned, trapped in an understanding of reality so limited that they could not perceive the forces they were provoking. They thought they were the masters. They learned too late that they were the judged. This is the lesson of Project Thunderbird. This is the warning that Thomas Bighorse left for future generations. The spiritual dimension of existence is real. The laws that govern it are just. And those who violate those laws, who abuse the innocent, who use their power to crush those they consider inferior, will face a reckoning that no human authority can prevent. The 47 soldiers who were imprisoned knew this. They endured their suffering with the certainty that justice would come, perhaps not in the form they expected, perhaps not on the timeline they would have chosen, but inevitably, inexorably, as surely as the sun rises each morning. Their faith was rewarded, their captors were judged, and their story, suppressed for decades, is finally being told. Let it serve as a reminder. There are powers in this world that governments cannot control. There are truths that official histories cannot erase. There are forces that protect the innocent and punish the guilty, operating according to principles that human laws can only dimly reflect. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ, the ultimate judge of the living and the dead, whose justice encompasses all the injustices that human courts allow to pass. Turn to the wisdom of the ancestors, whatever your ancestry may be, and find in that wisdom the strength to resist evil and the faith to trust that righteousness will prevail. The indigenous soldiers who were imprisoned in the United States were not forgotten. The spirits remembered them. The ancestors fought for them. And in the end, despite everything that was done to silence them, their truth has survived. May it never be forgotten again. May it serve as a warning to all who would abuse their power. And may it bring hope to all who suffer injustice, reminding them that the darkness, however deep it seems, cannot endure forever. The eagles are still watching, the thunder is still coming, and the judgment that fell upon Project Thunderbird is still available, waiting to descend upon all who think themselves above the law of the Creator. Remember this story, tell it to your children, and never doubt that justice, though it may be delayed, will never be denied. The ancestors are watching, the spirits are waiting, and the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, will always rise again.